welcome to this special edition podcast, West Hills, A History. And I am Will Duvall, I'm the lead pastor here currently, but as we're going to tell the story, and we'll discover soon enough, been plenty of predecessors before me, so I'm honored to serve as lead pastor now, and I'm especially honored to sit down this afternoon with some of our senior saints and some of our treasured members and who hold the treasures of the history and annals of this church and in their minds and hearts, and we just are honored to be able to hear your stories and all collectively as a church get to know more of the story of what God has done at and through the ministry of this church over the years to His glory. So I want to start by having each of you just go around and briefly introduce yourself, your name, and when you came to West Hills, if you can remember. Some of you, it's been so long. When you came, well, I guess I should say when you came to Bethany Baptist, and we'll get to that too, the name change. So I don't think any of y'all came to West Hills, did you? You came to Bethany Baptist. So when did you come, and how long either were you here, have you been here? So why don't we start here, and we'll work our way clockwise. Miss Barbara.
My name is Barbara Underwood. I came in 1973, and I did not come by myself. Along with my family, Bob and our son, Brad, 11 deaf people came with me at the same time.
Well, that's part of this story we want to hear too, is the deaf ministry here for so many years. So it's great to thank you for being back to help us record this. That's Cindy.
I'm Cindy Fisher. I think I was dragged here in 1976. I was in college, I came home, my mom had switched churches on me. My parents were divorced, we only had one car, so I had to go to this church. Whereupon I met Doug Fisher, who became my husband many years later. He does not remember meeting me, but I remember meeting him.
I don't think I knew that y'all met here at the church.
We did.
Praise the Lord. How about you, Doug?
I'm Doug Fisher. I'm the oldest son of the first pastor of Bethany Baptist, and I came with my family when I was in 7th grade in November of 1969 when my dad came down to St. Louis from suburban Chicago as the founding pastor.
Yeah, definitely. You've got a unique perspective, not only founding pastor's son, but being young at the time when some of that. So I'm curious to hear your perspective as well. Thanks for being with us, both of y'all. I'm Sandy.
I'm Sandy Smith, and I came here in 1973, brought all of my family, and I think I have really grown in Christ since I've been here.
Praise the Lord. Yeah.
Hi.
Last but not least.
Oh, okay, I'm June Nystrom. I have a frog for some reason.
Uh-oh.
And I've been here from the start of the church. And so that was, I always forget the date, but
Yeah, we got some of the
two-
founding documents here, don't we?
Early spring of 1968 is when you guys
Yeah.
started
Okay.
meeting and talking about
okay.
it.
So let's start with you then, Miss June, and
Okay.
talk about that. So tell us about the founding of the church. You know, where did the impetus, the desire, the dream, the calling come from to found Bethany Baptist, and tell us that story.
Okay. We were sitting in Memorial Press Church in Clayton, and they were saying, heaven came down, and glory filled my soul. And then we it sort of triggered a visit that we had in Minneapolis with one of Len's really good friends.
This is your husband, Len?
Yeah, my husband Len. And so on the way home, I said to Len, you know, maybe we should be starting another church. And so anyhow, it happened, and that song was so good, heaven came down and glory filled my soul. And so we were so enamored with that song was something that we sang when we went up to Founders Week in Minneapolis, and we stayed with Len's college friends, and so we just decided, well, let's go for it.
And I'm doing the math, so you are 99 and a half now.
I am.
You'll turn
I'm gonna be
100, God willing, this June. So I'm doing the math, that was 55 years ago, right? Really coming up on 56 years ago. So you were mid-40s at the time, and you said y'all had some experience with
Yeah.
church plants in the
Right.
past. Good, okay. And who else, so it was you and Lynn, and then who else was a part of that initial, where
Yeah.
did you go from there? You
And the
went up to
Conyers.
Wheaton,
Yeah,
you went up to Wheaton with a couple other couples, right?
we started in, yeah.
Right, yeah. And you
Right.
said you did sort of almost like a
Turnaround.
discernment vision
Yeah.
trip up there and talked to the denomination.
But we didn't talk to the denomination.
You didn't at that point.
We just remembered that we sang that song up in Minneapolis at our friend's house, and so, it just seemed, well, let's do it.
So who were those other,
And they were college friends from, Dakotas,
okay,
and, they always liked us to come. Not when we left our winter coats in the closet, they had to mail them to us.
were they, so who were the other founding
Okay,
couples
that was-
here in St. Louis
Okay,
with y'all when
It
you?
was Conyers, and they went back home after they retired,
Okay,
and he has cancer right now, I don't know how he's doing. I don't think he's gonna make it, but anyhow, and she was a nurse at St. Joe's Hospital here, so they contributed a lot, and then when we met at the school, I said to Marvin, oh, are we ready to charter yet? He said, no, we don't have enough people to charter.
is that Marvin Conyer?
Yeah,
Isn't it? Okay.
yeah.
So it was just the four of you at that point?
No, Horns.
And the
were there.
horns, okay.
And, so,
I can just add a few others, because I have a early history of the church. We had, from early days, a church historian, and Sherry Conyers was our church historian. And she would write a report every year and include it in our annual report. And I have what I think is the earliest one here, and it talks about the initial group. A meeting was held at the Nystrom's home with Robert Nordstrom, who was, I think, one of the officials from
the
the
BGC,
Baptist General Conference Home Missions Department. And it was the Conyers, the Nystroms, Lynn and June, Mary Withrow, who was a single teacher, Margaret Dresser, also a single teacher, and the Johnsons, and I'm going blank on
they
the
were
Johnsons.
visitors,
Okay,
because they used to be in the BGC, and then there wasn't one here, so they went to a different Baptist church, Tower Grove or whatever it's called.
so what happened here is June and Len were coming from a Baptist General Conference in suburban Chicago, and the Conyers had, at least at one point, they were in Wisconsin, and
That's where they're from.
yes, and they had been in a Baptist General Conference church up there. And the Horns had been in a Baptist General Conference church up in suburban Chicago, Tony and Helen. And so the initial group were largely people who had been in Baptist General Conference churches, primarily up in the Chicago area, who had, because of jobs, were down in St. Louis now.
Right.
And been attending other churches, but we can get into some of the reasons why they thought there was a need for a Baptist General Conference church down in the St. Louis area.
Yeah, because you said y'all were were you regularly attending Memorial Presbyterian
No,
at the time?
no.
It was just a special
They had
service?
a good evening service,
Okay,
and this Will Erickson, who used to I'll play the organ here, which we don't have. And he invited us to come that
Okay.
night.
So were the 3 or 4 original couples, were y'all all kind of at different churches already
Yeah.
in the area at that
We
time?
were,
Mostly Baptist or
Yeah. was
like Southern Baptist? Or were there any, was Bethany Baptist the first BGC, Baptist General Conference church here in town? That was kind of my understanding.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so you couldn't have been in another BGC church, but
Right.
was it like Southern Baptist churches you were here in town or?
Well, I guess Kirkwood Baptist was Southern Baptist at that time, now there's something different.
Okay. Gotcha. And I see here that you were the founding social chairwoman of the church.
You had to be everything.
Yeah, I know, when you got 11 adults.
Social
President.
chairman,
So Marvin Conyers, chairman, Lynn Nystrom, vice chairman, Anton, is it Anton?
Yes.
Anton
Tony.
Horn, Tony Horn, clerk treasurer, and then you were the social chairwoman. So tell us some of those stories of I see here, potlucks through that summer of 1968, still praying, discerning, okay, is God calling this to be an official
Yeah, right.
official church? So when did that, was it
When
later
we-
in
when we
that
had
fall?
72 people.
Whoa,
Then Marvin says we can charter and we go ahead.
wow. So was that like later in that same year, 1968, or was that the following?
Following,
69?
yeah, and then we were at the conference and we took the Fishers. We talked to your dad at the conference, Doug.
Yes, this would be the annual meeting of the
Yeah.
Baptist General Conference.
In 1969, and your dad was there.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah,
was
that-
when those conversations started of calling him as the first pastor?
I believe so.
Yeah, I think so.
I think so the Baptist General Conference is the national body, and then our regional organization was the Midwest
Midwest.
Baptist Conference, and the head of the Midwest Baptist Conference, Cliff Anderson, was charged, I think, with trying to find some prospects for a pastor for this new work, and he talked to my dad about the possibility, and I think that probably prompted the discussion at the annual meeting.
Okay. And up until that point in time, it had mainly been potlucks, prayer. You mentioned meeting together in the early days for prayer just in your living room. I
Yeah.
think I romanticized the story a little bit
Yeah.
in church, and,
Yeah.
and I got corrected. It was not in your basement, but in your living room.
Want to be in my basement.
Yeah. In your living room, you had, I think I conflated because at one point, Gary Brooks's house, we'll get to that part of the story,
Yeah,
used to be the old parish of the church, right? And at one point, y'all were doing some kind of meetings in his basement, right?
It was
Some kind of
my
Bible
basement then.
Your basement at the time, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
So
the church
parish.
owned the house, but we were living there, and we had all kinds of meetings in the basement. We can get into that. a little bit
Okay.
later.
So, but initially, your house, mainly prayer, because you didn't have a preacher per se, it wasn't an official service, but
no,
prayer, still praying about, hey, what is
yeah,
this?
and then our group, we went out after the evening service. We either went to somebody's house or we went to a restaurant. And that was fun. Right, Barbara?
Yes.
So you were already at the point. Okay, so let's get the Fishers coming in then. So 1969,
Yeah,
you guys go up to the general conference meeting.
well, Cliff, I think, it was here negotiating and stuff.
Okay, and that's when Bethany Baptist was officially chartered
Right.
as a BGC church.
Right,
Still kind of talking, interviewing pastors at the time, and so. Doug, do you remember how long was it after that before you guys actually, your dad accepted the call, moved down?
Yes, I actually have the documents of my dad's letter accepting the call. But what happened is the group down here, we came down, it must have been the summer or so of 1969, after that meeting at the annual meeting. We came down and my dad candidated, so we had a little bit of a quasi evening service in the Nystrom's living room. And I remember sitting there, and my dad gave a sermon, and then we went back up to suburban Chicago, and I think the group here then decided to issue a call to my dad, and he accepted, and so we came November 1 of 1969. The parsonage was being built. The church bought the parsonage, got some financial aid from I think your former church, June, which I think was Evangel up in suburban
Yeah,
Chicago
right.
in Wheaton, and maybe some help. Though later we definitely got help from both the Midwest Baptist Conference and the Baptist General Conference to help pay a part of my dad's salary in the early years, and it dropped off over a number of years. So then services started right away in November, later in November, I believe it was, of 1969. And it's interesting, they started right away with a morning worship service, an evening worship service, and a Wednesday night prayer meeting.
Wow.
Like bang from the beginning.
The old Baptist standard.
And yeah, and then in the spring of 70,
Now, those services, real quick, were where? Because the church, this building
Well,
wasn't built at the time, so
I think the early services were.
is it a school? At some
We,
point,
well,
y'all were in
initially
school,
the
right?
worship service was at Parkway South Middle School,
Okay.
which was a junior high school then they called it, on 141. And we met there actually for 5 years before we bought the land here and
Right.
built the initial building here.
Right.
And so the Sunday evening services, we met in people's houses on Sunday evening, and then I think eventually we had all of them in the basement of the parsonage. And we used to have Wednesday night prayer meeting in our living room in the parsonage. And
What were
we
the-
even had like youth group meetings in our house.
What were the Sunday night services, out of curiosity? So you had typical worship service Sunday morning, prayer service Wednesday night. What was the Sunday night service?
Sunday night was probably a typical Baptist Sunday night service of that era, and it would have been maybe a more casual worship service.
Okay. Okay.
And
Gotcha.
then things changed around the late 70s, early 80s. We can talk about that in
Okay.
terms of the Sunday evening service.
Okay. So at Parkway South for those first 5 years, and any I don't know, that still at that point would have been just y'all, because Miss Barbara and Miss Sandy, y'all didn't come till 73, you said, which was the year that the building was built, right?
Well, I think we occupied the
doors
building in.
open till 75.
Yes,
Oh, really?
I mean, the
Okay.
building wasn't.
The land.
Yeah.
Was purchased.
Well, yeah, I forget the exact year the land was purchased, but it probably was about 74-ish.
Okay.
Maybe 73.
I'm trying to remember back to when I was, Pastor Thadley's our entry point with all the dates and stuff now, but I want to say it was 73 is what we tell people the land, at least land was purchased. So doors weren't open until 75. So,
Yeah.
so y'all came in the midst of that, and the church was still meeting at Parkway South at that point?
They were here.
They were here. All right, so it must have been either y'all didn't come till a little later, or it opened in 73. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, my recollection of what our entry point dates, which again maybe they're not right, but yeah, I thought I was thinking it was 73 was right around when the building was built, but maybe not.
Well, the groundbreaking, and I have the official invitation, so
Yeah.
this is authoritative.
Yeah, what does it say?
March 17th, 1974
74. Okay.
is the groundbreaking, and I think the building was first occupied in 1975, I think.
You would think it would take about a year to build, yeah.
Yeah. So,
So if y'all came here, you must have come, I guess, a little later, if, you know, if the building wasn't built till 75.
Well, the building was
No, it
very
was
new when
finished.
I came.
Brand new,
Yeah.
Brand
Yeah.
new building.
yeah,
It was
okay.
finished then.
So tell me about that. Tell me about, you know, that, because that's a big step in the life of a church. At that point, you're kind of moving out of a church plant and becoming, you know, all right, we're putting down roots, we're buying this land, we're building this building. Was that I mean, again, you have a unique perspective on it, Doug, because you're probably, your dad's coming home and maybe sharing things around the dinner table. What was that?
yeah,
like?
let me just make one point. Why is the church located where it is?
Yeah,
West County was exploding in growth.
Hmm.
Farmland was being converted to subdivisions at a rapid rate.
Hmm.
And Cliff Anderson, who was the executive director, or whatever his title was, the head of the Midwest Baptist Conference, had done a study before all of this of where to plant a church. And I think he was looking demographically at the growth, and obviously when people are moving into new houses, they're also looking for new churches. And so that's why the church was planted in West County.
yeah,
As for looking for the land, that went on for a long time, and for a long time, we looked at some land that was off of 141, but couldn't talk the guy who owned it into selling it. It's about where the Schnucks is at Clayton and 141 there, right
Okay.
now, that's on that land.
yeah,
And finally, this piece of land opened up. And we actually had some reservations about it because back in that era, you thought about a church being in a residential community.
Hmm.
And this was by the highway, and so we actually were a little bit concerned about that. The Lord had different plans, and that's actually been a great advantage of having the visibility of being on what is now an interstate.
yeah.
And the land was purchased, I think the listing price was about $55,000, but I think the selling family made a donation of $5,000, so the net cost to us was $50,000.
Wow.
And this is before really inflation took hold and real estate values just exploded
Yeah,
within like a couple of years
yeah.
of buying the land.
Wow, it is hard to believe. You know, you hear those numbers and even looking at the picture, because you know, you mentioned the groundbreaking, and I think one of the pictures we use in Entry Point is, you know, and you look around in the background and there's like nothing, like you said. I mean, it's still yet to be built up. I'm kind of surprised to hear that 141 was even there already. You know, just from the stories I've heard about.
Well, it's
how-
been rebuilt. It's
Yeah,
a
I'm
little
sure
bit
it has.
different.
Yeah, dirt road. Well, that's so interesting. So sounds like built in less than a year. Yeah. Who now at that point in time? What was even like the size like at that point? So
Well-
now we're in 74, 75. You know, I'm anticipating that was a part of the impetus to move from the school and renting to the building was we're outgrowing. So what June, do you remember, like right around, or maybe even Barbara Sandy, when y'all were coming around 75, what was the size of the church at that point?
Wasn't real large, but it was enough to keep the payroll, I think, going.
At that point, was your
So-
dad the only one on payroll, or did-
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
He was doing it all.
So he was the sole, staff person. And the church, we organized in April 1970 with 32 charter members, and then about a year later, we had 42. And so here I have an article in the denominational magazine, The Standard, from June of 71,
Hmm.
and it talks about attendance being near 70. And we sort of capped out at the school, and it was a financial strain to buy the land, and then to build the first building, because we weren't that large, but people gave very sacrificially and generously.
Mm.
But as soon as we moved into the building, our growth exploded. You know, and my dad would say, people now view us as a permanent part of the community, not some fly-by-night operation.
Yeah.
You know, when you're meeting in a school, some people just think, well, is this church gonna make it?
We'll see.
You know, what, you know, so that was that was really a key turning point.
Big turning
I
point.
remember the Farrars, they wanted to join us, but they didn't want to join us until we had a building.
That's right, yeah, I recall
Yeah.
that, June, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Martin and Lorraine Farrar.
wow, okay.
Okay, you want to hear a little bit about the parsonage?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, all right, we, had, that was a pretty big step, I think, that house. But anyhow, we were deciding about, the land and everything, and, we had to make up our minds on a Monday, and so, in the middle of the night, I woke up and I said, oh, we don't want that one with all the steps over there across the road. I said, we want the one that we picked out now, because people could come and park and they could go downstairs and they didn't have to enter the kitchen, I mean.
It had a walk-in
Basement.
basement, yes.
So anyhow.
And this was before the building. This was
Yes,
3-4
Yeah.
years
Very
before the
early.
building.
This
Right.
would be in 1969.
Which typically you think of a parsonage being tied to, you know, the
Yeah.
building, so, you know, pastor can just
But
walk back and
Those
forth. But
guys, the other two, Cliff and Marvin, they thought we should have that other one because it was all built and we could just move in, there wouldn't be any hassle about it. And I thought, well, the Lord woke me up in the middle of the night and said, no, that's not the good choice, take the other one. So anyhow,
So June was right.
that was good enough for them.
yeah.
So that's how y'all decided to purchase.
Yeah.
What was your first home here in St. Louis?
So when we moved here, the house was being built and it wasn't done. So we stayed in the basement, our whole family of 6 people, stayed in the basement of the Horns, Tony and Helen Horn, for a few weeks until the parsonage was completed.
Yeah.
Tell them the story about how they pounded your kitchen.
Well, then when we moved into the parsonage, the church had what Helen Horn called a pounding, where they give you a
Sounds
pound of
violent.
everything.
Oh, good. Okay, that's
And
better.
like a pound of flour, pound of
Yeah.
sugar, you know, things like that. And so Helen went to Deerberg's on 141 and Olive there and bought more groceries than we had ever seen in our life, and she piled it into the pantry and totally filled it. And then, you know, she bought a bunch of chickens and put them in the freezer. It was crazy. I remember that because it was sort of overwhelming and really appreciative to us as we were moving down here. And you know, my dad actually took a cut and pay to come down here. You know, I remember my parents up in Illinois.
Where was he before that?
He was at Cumberland Baptist Church in Mount Prospect, Illinois.
Okay.
And I remember them talking around the kitchen table like, can we live on $700 a month, you know? And that's what you know, these numbers, you
Sure.
have to inflate them for
Sure.
inflation. But yeah, you know, so it was a step of faith on the part of our family. But it was one of the best things that ever happened to our family, and we can talk about that too.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, no, I would be curious to hear more about, you know, just how it impacted the life of your family too, Doug. And yeah, Barbara, jump in.
Well, I'd just like to say why I was here, why my family was here.
Please.
Because I was Doug's math teacher at Parkway West High School, and my husband and I were looking for a church.
Did he invite you?
And he kept inviting, and at that time, I was Southern Baptist and didn't think I would ever belong to any church except Southern Baptist. And he said, no, you just need to come. He kept insisting and insisting. And so finally we came, and like I said, 11 deaf people came with me. And when we came first, interviewing with the pastor before we actually attended a service. And he took us into the auditorium and said,
This is
now,
with his dad?
this
This
the
is
deaf.
with Elmer, yeah.
Well, yes, yeah, almost.
Okay. So
And-
you're interviewing him about, is this the church for
Well,
us?
yeah, because you bring 11 deaf with you, you know, how does the church feel about that?
And what was your connection there? How did you?
I was the interpreter of the deaf at Baldwin Baptist
Oh, okay.
Church, and we were exiting that
Okay.
church.
Okay.
And we had gone to several churches in this area, and they would always put us in the balcony or the back corner of the church where we wouldn't be a distraction. But Pastor Fisher said, here's our auditorium, where would you like to sit? And I remember Clovis Williams saying, we want to sit right up there by the organ because we can feel that with our hands and our feet. And Pastor said, okay. And I was dumbfounded that he would put us right at the front of the church.
Now I can't pay people to sit on the front row now, so the times have changed.
Yeah.
Oh, y'all, the Arms, okay, yeah, thank y'all for being front row people. Second row, y'all on the second row, yeah.
And there was one other time, and well, that just impressed us so much. And when we had to make the
That is-
decision whether to go back to Baldwin or to come to Bethany, all of the deaf said, Beth Annie, Beth Annie, we want to go to Beth Annie. And it was because the people here received us so well. They were so
Yeah.
gracious and wonderful and open.
Yeah.
And then one other thing that really impressed the deaf, I don't know if Doug remembers this or not, but one time we came and it was raining. And you and Steve had umbrellas. Do you remember going out and having umbrellas and helping?
I don't,
people?
maybe that, not that specific one, but there, I think there were several times when we did that, yeah.
Yeah.
I
And
don't
they
think we
were-
were the only people doing it, I think some other people
Well,
at
you were
church
young,
did.
and they were impressed that two young people would be out
Mm.
there doing. I don't think they may have not known at that time you were the pastor's sons.
Hmm.
But anyway, it was another impressive. I'm just trying to have you see the flavor
Paint the picture,
of
yeah.
the beginning of this church.
That's wonderful, thank you. Yeah, a real James II kind of moment, that sitting on the front row. I love that. And how about you, Sandy? Because this, I mean, catches up to where you are in the story. So buildings built, you come right around that time in '75. So tell us about, yeah, what brought you there?
Well, I just kept passing it as I was going down the highway, and
Were you guys already at a church at that point too, or?
yeah, and it was over on at Baptist Church on Ladue and
Green
Olive or
Trails
something.
Baptist
Parkway
Church.
Baptist?
You were at Green Trails
Green-
Baptist
oh,
Church.
Yeah,
Okay.
Green Roads.
I don't even think it exists anymore.
Yeah. No, I was just sitting here thinking, when the church was about finished, Tony Horn was on the roof in a Superman costume. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
What was that all about?
Oh, he was really funny, and he was just on the roof in his costume. And
He was
waving
our
at everybody.
building chairman and,
Is this
yeah.
a fundraising endeavor or?
No, Tony was just a little bit crazy.
Yeah, I never met him. I'm trying to think back. I overlapped. I met Helen. I think I was here like literally a week before she passed away, maybe 2 weeks. I remember coming and when I was hired in 2015, and Andy was still pushing her in the wheelchair, and it wasn't even a week or two, I think, that fall before she passed. So, but I heard nothing but great things about them too. One of the 4 founding couples. So, what else? So how long? Let's come back to the deaf, because I know there was a active deaf ministry at the church for many years, and eventually a deaf church that was planted out
Right,
of Bethany
right.
Baptist. So
There's a very
when did that
end-
start? Were you at the center of that, or?
Yes, in the early years when I was here, I was really not associated that much with the hearing church because I was with the deaf. The deaf church just exploded when, but it wasn't a church then, it was just 11 people. But when they left, and I don't remember when the deaf left because either the deaf had to leave or the hearing, we got too big for
Hmm.
all of us to be in this building.
Hmm.
And there were 75 people
Whoa.
left. So it grew in that period of time. And
The
one of
deaf
the reasons,
ministry.
well, one of the reasons I think it grew, who knows, but Pastor had had a stroke and was, and this is Pastor Fisher I'm referring to.
Okay.
And he was confined to his bed a lot. And one of the things he would do, he would take the membership and he would pray for certain members of the family that day. And then you would get a note saying that he had prayed for you.
Hmm.
Well, for the deaf and for me, that was amazing.
Hmm.
And I think the Lord used that example to bring other deaf in.
Hmm.
And I have to say it, about that time, God raised up a deaf man, Tom Lovis, who at one time literally slammed the door in my face and said, I'm a Catholic, I don't need you, and I was scared to death to go visit him again. But again, Clovis Williams, one of the deaf people, went with me and invited him. And a year later, he came to visit here. And for a year, he studied the book of John.
Hmm.
He was very curious, very intelligent man. And after 1 year, he talked with Pastor Fisher to let him know that he had accepted Christ and he wanted to be baptized.
Wow.
So a man who almost threw me out of his home a year or two later was a Christian.
Wow. And so he was a part of that deaf community that helped go and plant
Yes.
that church subsequently?
This church later ordained him. He became the pastor.
Wow. And about when was that? You said, was that around when Elmer had
That
his
had
stroke?
to be in the early to mid 80s.
80s.
Okay.
I think.
So let me back up then, because I don't want to skip too far. So how long was your dad the pastor here?
About 12 years.
12 years. Okay. So 71.
Well, yeah, it depends on how you count it.
Yeah,
You know,
69,
the church legally organized in 70, but he came
Okay.
November 1 of
69, so early 80s.
and left August of 82.
82. Okay. So 12, 13 years.
Yeah.
And tell me more about even just, you started to tell the story of, you got in the building, 75, started it to really grow pretty quickly, take off. Yeah, how did it impact, the culture of the, I mean, it sounds like still there's very much a tight-knit community, welcoming, hospitable culture of the church at that point. But how did that grow the ministries of the church? I mean, how long was it before your dad started getting more? Was it still kind of volunteer staffing, or were they hiring more staff and getting other deacons, elders, leaders? What was the culture and the ministries and the kind of infrastructure of the church looking like?
Yeah, I don't know how much I can remember with specificity. We did hire an associate pastor somewhere, I think in the mid to late 1970s.
Okay.
Circa.
Paterka, yeah,
Heard that name.
Dan Paterka, and we had a secretary, probably part-time, various numbers of hours of a church secretary, and that was pretty much it during his tenure. He had a stroke in, what year would have that been, Cindy?
So he died he was 56 when he died in 1982, and he had a stroke when he was 50, if you do the math.
Yeah, so he had a very severe stroke.
Mm.
And was out of the pulpit for 18 months, and very graciously, the church continued to pay his full salary.
Mm.
And we had, I think, a couple of interim pastors who were retired pastors. And then he came back to the pulpit and served for a few years, and then went to a church out in California.
Oh, okay.
And then was there about a year and a half before he passed away.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he did make a recovery and bounce
Yes,
back
yes,
from that.
yes, but
So he left the pastorate here in what year then, you said?
82.
No, he died in 82. He left in 81.
81,
In
yes,
81,
yes,
okay.
yeah, it would have been like the
August.
August of 81, I believe.
And was it an interim pastor that replaced him, or for a
Yes,
while?
we had an interim for a while, and then, and I don't remember exactly how long, but our second.
And were y'all still in town at that point?
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
so
yeah.
you graduated high school,
I
all that,
remained
stuck
here,
around.
my family
They
abandoned
moved.
me.
Yeah, okay. Gotcha.
No, we all went to school up at Bethel, what's now Bethel University, and, my siblings married people who went to Bethel, and they ended up, at least for some time, in the Twin Cities.
Staying up north.
And my parents went to California, and I
Okay.
was here with Cindy.
So yeah, you moved back, and so interim pastor for a year or two.
Something like that. It was, yeah, it was a while. And then John Dickow was our second pastor.
Okay. And what? So yeah, around 83, 84.
So he married us, and we got married in May of 83.
Okay.
So I think he was probably here, probably, if your dad left in
82
81, he
maybe.
probably came in 82.
End of 82. Okay. So John Dickow, and where did he come from?
Nebraska or someplace.
Okay.
Okay, I don't recall, but I'm sure Junes has it right.
Okay.
He was a pastor there, and then I think he was only here for 4 or 5 years. 5.
Okay.
And then he took a pastorate, I believe, in California. And then we went through a period without, we had interims for a while. And then we had our second pastor, and that's a little bit of a
Third
tale.
now.
Third pastor.
Third now.
I'm sorry, third.
So your dad, Elmer, John
John
Dickow, and then Jerry Marshall, right?
Right.
So after the interim, so that would have been late 80s at that point? Or if you had a couple years of interim, maybe it was even into the 90s at that point, or? Couldn't have been into the 90s. I mean,
It
Gary
was-
was
it
here
was
for
late
29
80s.
years.
Jerry Marshall was only here a year and a half, and that's another story, but I know that he left.
Oh, we want to give him the juicy stuff, Cindy.
We can do that too. That's probably why you have me here, right? He left I know he left after our son was born, and our son was born in 1987. Jerry Marshall left in 1988, probably in the spring.
Okay.
After
And
only
you
being
said he
a
was
year
here only 18 months, I
and a half.
think. Okay.
Yes, he wanted to do a seeker-sensitive church, and he wanted to do it yesterday.
Oh, that's interesting.
And he had a group of people that he'd already talked to, and one Sunday, he stood up in pulpit and left, and the next Sunday, half the church was gone. We lost, Doug can tell you more, we not only lost the pastor, but we lost the head elder, and Doug became the next
Whoa.
guy.
Yeah, we didn't have elders then, we were deacons, but I mean,
Right.
we had, we probably lost closer to 40%, but we lost a lot of the people, the leaders, and I was the vice chairman of the deacon board, and I was the most senior person, so we lost the moderator, the vice moderator, and the chairman of the deacon board.
Wow.
And, it was a shock to all of us, since I guess, Jerry didn't talk to those of us who he knew probably weren't interested,
Mm.
and so they all were gone.
It was all behind closed
And,
doors.
we're struggling to pay the mortgage on the church. And Cindy and I went into crisis mode because we had to put out a letter right away to say what's going on
Yeah.
and what are we doing about it. So we put out a letter,
Were you on
to
staff
the
at that point,
congregation.
Cindy?
No, she
Okay.
was,
Because I knew you
she
came on
was my
staff.
brains.
I have a public relations background.
Okay.
It's kind of obvious that you need to do something,
Yeah.
and usually that's communicating.
PR nightmare.
It was really a hard time. I know that the deacons sat around the table and talked about, do we sell the church? What are our options here? We had another man, Mark Blyer. I don't know if he was a deacon, but he was a very wise man. He'd been with Campus Crusade in Africa for a few years with his wife and family. He was now in St. Louis, with a regular type job, he gave that sermon the first Sunday after Jerry left, and it was just a beautiful way of looking at this, that God's got plans no matter what. And
Yeah, he spoke on the passage where Paul and Barnabas, right, split and had a disagreement.
God used
And
it for his
he,
purpose.
he used that story to say, hey, this has happened before, and God's church endures, and it was a real encouragement to those of us who were here, who were really hurting at that time.
Really, I'm sure. It's interesting to hear.
Yeah.
As many times I've heard different versions of that story, I've actually never heard that take on it. I don't want to call it take, like it's not factual, but I've never heard the dimension of Jerry wanting to move Bethany in a more seeker-friendly, seeker-sensitive, seeker-driven, whatever kind of early Willow Creek type of philosophy of ministry. That's very interesting to me because I've now met Jerry and met with other. Well, I coach his replacement's daughter in volleyball and basketball now, so I've gotten to be friends with their current pastor of that church. But the version I heard from them was that when he was interviewed here, that he was very clear that the leadership structure of the church biblically should include elders and deacons, and Bethany Baptist didn't have elders, and he was going to move it in a direction of having an elder council, and that there was resistance to that. And after 18 months, he just couldn't endure the lack of biblical fidelity of the leadership structure here. So it's just obviously there's always two sides to every story. It's just interesting. And again, I'm hearing that hearsay from, but so that. Again, not that we necessarily need to go, but that was 88. So that's 88, and church is reeling, cut almost in half. So how did you see God provide through that? And so you're in leadership at the time, Doug, and you kind of vicariously too, I'm sure, Cindy, and I mean, you all are here through that, but are you all in leadership roles at the church at that point in time? Barbara, Sandy, June, or
My husband was.
was he also on the
deacon at that time.
board? Okay.
I was on the call committee for Jerry Marshall. I do not know that version that you're talking about. Wayne McCullum was also on that call committee. I think if that was a big thing, Wayne and I would have known about it.
Remember?
And would remember it, and I just don't. I do know that he did have a great respect for the church you mentioned in Chicago, Willow Creek.
Oh, interesting.
I did know that. But I think it's interesting that as somebody has said, the rest of the story
Exactly.
is that the people who went with him, eventually half of them left him.
almost all of them in a year were gone.
Yeah, they had all gone.
He
And
had
they are the founders of the Crossing. So
That's
I think
where
it's-
I knew the Crossing came into the story too.
Right, so I think
Crossing
the
Church,
Barnabas
just for those.
story of
Yeah, one of the biggest
partying
churches
and
in
what God did, there's three churches
three
today.
churches: New Community Church, the Crossing, and now West Hills. Yeah, God's power of redemption and taking all that brokenness and turning it for good. That's amazing. Well, let's back up and just all throughout there. Obviously, the ministry of the church goes on, and I'd love to hear more. And maybe Cindy, you and I don't know if any of the rest of y'all played a role in volunteering. One of when I hear stories of people not infrequently coming back to West Hills even today and saying, "Oh yeah," they're in their 30s and 40s, and saying, "Oh yeah, I came to this church, 30 years ago for Awana," and Awana was apparently one of the biggest, I think, ministries and outreaches of the church. But I'd be curious to hear just more of even, the ministries that we've heard about, the deaf ministry. Obviously, we talk about the pastoral ministry and corporate worship, but what were some of those other behind the scenes, or not behind the scenes, but you know what I'm saying, like the actual ministry that has been impactful over the years, that it has touched lives through the ministry of the church?
One of the big ministries was our preschool, and Freda Lois Loafman, I think she ran it the entire time, I'm not sure. It was a huge ministry. I think it was well respected. It was a morning program here. It was definitely not daycare, it was preschool, and she ran it.
It's like a Monday to Friday?
Might have been Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
Okay. I have never even heard that there was a preschool.
Oh yeah, there was a preschool here.
Wow.
Yeah, let me go back though early on, something that maybe we should emphasize. So what was our distinctive from some of the Southern Baptist churches that populated this area? And what my father used to say, and what we tried to implement, it's always imperfect, was, at that era, a lot of Southern Baptist churches, and, Barbara, correct me if I overstate this, but every Sunday there would be an altar call, and there was a real strong emphasis on evangelism. And we had a very strong emphasis on evangelism, but we also were concerned about raising Christians who were mature in their faith and had what we would, in that day you would use the word, maybe a deeper Christian life were some of the terms that were used. And so we emphasized that we were not only concerned about evangelism, but once people were here, that they grow
Discipleship.
in their faith. And, but going back to evangelism, that was very important. I mean, some of the things that we did, you don't do anymore. When we were starting the church, and even when we were at the school, all these new houses were being built. We would go around
Door to door.
on Sunday afternoon with a brochure that introduced the church. And I did this with my father, and other members of the leaders of the church would do this, shaking people, ringing on people's doorbells, talking to them. People actually would talk to you
Back then.
Now that, they don't, that's considered sort of an affront
Yeah.
to do that, but it was relevant to that era, and we did a lot of that. There's something in here, approximately 1,500 invitational survey calls have been made by the congregation. This was in '71. So, we just did a lot of this. And, we had talks in this denominational newspaper about early on having a women's group with a Bible study, a book study that had an evangelistic message. It talks about my dad being involved in a program called Men Sharing Christ, which was some training for the men of the church in evangelism. And later we got involved in using Evangelism Explosion from down at J.D. Kennedy's church in Coral Ridge, Florida. So there was always an emphasis on evangelism, but also deeper discipleship.
Yeah. Wow. Very neat.
One of the outreach programs that my husband and I were involved in was we would take bread. We had a little basket ministry, we called it, and every visitor that came here and would give us enough information that we could get to their house, that week we would take a loaf of bread and other little things.
That was still going when I got here in 2015.
Really?
Yeah, I don't remember who it was. At one point it was the Beldings, but was driving all over town to newcomers' houses to drop off loaves of bread.
Right.
Yeah.
I thought that was a good ministry.
Yeah. Other ministries y'all can think of, or stories from that time that get
We
us.
had a good women's ministry on Tuesday morning with a good Bible study, and we had a guest speaker, might be a doctor, might be so-and-so. So it was quite
Yeah, it
effective.
was called Spice of Life. It
Yeah.
was just a huge group in the early years. I caught the tail end of it, but
It's like a
I
cooking
think-
club?
if you,
No.
no, but
No?
if you
Spice of
look
Life,
hard
I don't know.
around here, you might find a paperback version of a recipe book made by the Spice of Life ladies.
Yeah.
There's two of them, two versions out there.
Right.
I still have mine.
Yeah.
I still have mine.
Really?
Both of
That's
them.
funny. Yeah, that's really neat. Okay, so let's go back, because we've been going almost an hour, we haven't even got to Pastor Gary, who was here for 29 and a half years. So that takes us up to, Jerry left in 88, maybe some interim after that for a little bit. And so, I mean, if Gary was here 29 years until 2019, that would have been 1990, right? So Gary came in 1990, sound right?
Yes.
Somewhere around
Yeah.
there? Okay. And it seems to me like a lot of what you would consider bigger changes in terms of rocking the boat in the history of the church came even since then. So talk me through that. I know there was the name change from Bethany Baptist to West Hills Community Church. I know there was ripping the pews out, getting chairs, choir robes, switching from hymnals. I mean, a lot of those worship war types of decisions were made sometime in the 90s, early 2000s. So tell me more about, just how y'all saw the church and the culture and all of that change in the 90s, 2000s under Pastor Gary's leadership.
Well, it seems like we used to know everybody and now we don't.
That's one thing. I mean, in terms of the culture of the church,
Yeah,
you
right.
do. So even with that, like you're saying, through these first three pastors, this church was still pretty had stabilized around what, 100 people, less than 100?
We actually got up to attendance, including the deaf, of approaching 300.
Well, yeah, 'cause you said there was 75
Under my
deaf
dad's tenure, yeah.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and I think that was before his stroke. So it would have been the late 70s.
Okay. And
I
but
remember
you still
one
knew everybody.
Sunday, we had a special, I don't remember what was special about it, but the deaf were in the choir. They did the choir that Sunday. And I know we had to bring chairs in. And pastor, your dad was still pastor here. And he said, we are very close to 400.
Wow.
And we had the balcony and we had people out. It was a special Sunday.
Well, that's like where we are now. We are very close to 400 now. So you were there in the late 70s, and then with some of those pastoral transitions and everything in the 80s, there was some decline.
The short, when you have an interim, typically people don't want to commit to
Sure.
a church, new people who are coming in. And we had some short tenures of pastors, and I think from a numeric standpoint, those were difficult.
What happened to John Dickow, by the way? You said he was only here 3 years?
No, 5.
Five.
He was here
5.
5, and he went to another church.
Okay.
And eventually took some leadership position in our denomination later down the road for a few years.
Okay.
I don't recall that there was any issue at all. It was more of a decision he made on his own of just moving
Discerning
on.
God's call.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious. So yeah, but still with the interim and Jerry's shorter tenure. So Gary it brought stability when he came in, because he's here for 29 and a half years, but at the same time stability while also, like I said, some of those big changes. I'm curious to hear, because I can't imagine, leading a church through some of those big, decisions, changing the name, pulling the organ out, putting drums up there, like all those kinds of things. So was that did it feel like a stable time or did it feel tumultuous? Was there a lot of flux, a lot of people leaving? I mean, I'm grateful by the time I got here in 2015, those of y'all who had stuck around, it was like, I can't do anything to run them off because Gary tried and they're still here. So, but tell me about those years. And,
Well, those are difficult, because I think even some of us around that table had different viewpoints on some of those.
Yeah.
Like the name change, I know Barbara was not keen on that,
no.
and I don't recall where June was. And, you know,
You weren't a fan?
I don't remember.
You don't remember?
I was
You know,
on
I-
the committee,
You were on the committee, which,
and I did not go for the name change either,
really?
but-
Okay. So it was a split committee.
You know, I think the challenge was, we were Baptist in a Southern Baptist town, so what kind of Baptist were we? Which is challenging, and the Southern Baptists were going through some of their
Yep.
frictions over theological liberalism.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Baptist
in the
was
greater
backward.
world, Baptists were being known, rightly or wrongly, as contentious.
Yep.
Right.
And so those were some of the currents of what was going on. I
Well-
wasn't one of the instigators of the name change.
Well, and the denomination
but
itself
Gary
changed
was.
its name,
Yes,
right?
yes.
From Baptist General Conference to Converge.
Well, that came later, and I still
Oh, did it?
don't-
Okay.
I still don't quite understand Converge, what that is. but-
No one does. It sounds very cultish, but anyway. So Converge, that name change was after the
Yeah,
Baptist change.
that was quite a
Okay.
bit later, yeah.
Was it quite a bit? Okay.
Well, somewhat
I
later,
thought
yeah.
Converge, yeah, because I thought that was around 2008, and West Hills changed the name in, was it 2002? I think something like that.
Well, we had been part of
Okay,
a
this is
church,
Sally and Brian Arvison, by the way. Yeah, how can
and
you
we had
Sally?
been part of a church plant that folded. It was out of Central Pres. And so we were all looking for a church, and there was a family, the Ericksons, they had 2 young adopted sons. They would invite, our son was friends with them, and they would invite us to come to church here. But it was a Baptist church.
Hmm.
And I had grown up strict Southern Baptist, and I would go, no. not gonna." But then they changed the name, and as soon as they did, we were here.
So, you've got fruit. You've got fruit from even those contentious decisions that I'm sure.
And we were, it was the most welcoming place we'd ever been.
Yeah.
The cutoffs were here, and they were just unbelievable. So everybody just
What-
met us at the door.
Were there, because again, and I could be wrong about the dates and stuff, but from my, the story I've been told, it seemed like a lot of those changes were happening at the same time with Oregon Choir, Hymnals, Pews, name change, building the Dokes. A lot of those things happened. So was that, again, was there an exodus from the church at that time, or did most of the people on board along for the ride for that?
Well, you'd have to ask. I think some people didn't like some of the changes, but most of them stuck with it.
Okay. When did you guys leave?
2012.
2012.
So y'all were here through the changes.
Yeah.
And then, were you gonna jump into?
Yeah.
No, okay, sorry. And then, I'm just getting my history and timeline right. When was the building expansion? Was that before y'all left
The
also?
building expansion was finished right before the financial crisis of 2008.
Okay, so it was started
Yeah.
sometime before that.
So we got into some financial strain about the time of the building expansion, because just before the building, and Brian and I were involved in this, but I mean, the building expansion, we've been talking about various things, expanding the sanctuary, and then finally we decided to expand out the direction we did with the Doxa.
Was the church still around the same, like pushing 400 at that time?
No, it was less than
It was
that.
in
It was probably somewhere in the 200s, but I don't know that
So
exactly.
that's a practical question. Back when it was pushing 400 under your dad, were y'all all just, I mean, the fire
Well,
pit
yeah.
capacity of the sanctuary is like,
Well,
250 or
yeah,
something.
I mean, 400 was probably a peak. It wasn't a consistent.
was it one or two services?
One service.
All
It
just
was
one?
it was a, it wasn't a consistent.
Right.
I was gonna say, I don't know how you
thing.
fit
So
400
we were
people in
probably,
that room.
my guess is we were in the high 200s in that time consistently.
Yeah.
I have to go back and look at record. But, so just before we had been talking about expanding the building, but just before we did that, and Gary was probably the driving force behind that. And, just before that, the land next door came up for sale. And we'd always wanted that land.
The land to our west.
Where Promise Christian Academy is
Yes,
now.
and
So we didn't own it at that point.
It was a quick deal, and we made a decision to buy it.
Hmm.
And,
Because we needed money.
and we bought it, you know, and I think we paid about 900,000 or something like that for it. And then we moved forward with the building program at the same time, and that was too much.
It's a heavy hit, yeah.
Because we bought the land primarily with debt.
Yeah.
And that was a strain, and that's part of those financial strains.
Well, then 2008 hits.
Yeah, are part of the reason that Cindy and I was in leadership and involved in some things, and part of the reason that we left was somewhat related to those.
No, we left much later, but I think you could say
Well,
that.
that started some of our,
Strange.
challenges, you know. I just wasn't entirely in sync with, I was in leadership and I was a little bit out of sync with the rest of the leadership about some issues that weren't theological, just more administrative.
Practical. And when was the flood in there? Because I know that's a big
Oh.
talking
right.
point too. And again, the version of the story I've heard, that was pretty intricately interwoven with some of those struggles too, where, you know, we're in debt, and then the flood hits and we're out of our sanctuary for over a year, and, you know, the church just shrinks with everybody stuck in this little black box that nobody, so was that?
That was after, it had to be
yes.
after 2012.
I think it was in 2012 is what I've heard.
Could have been.
Okay, so in 2012, was that, I mean,
Is
from
it a
y'all's,
Is it a story of hiring somebody? It came because of the roofing job.
Right.
And was that a story of not hiring perhaps the best people for redoing the roof? Because it was open. It was
that's what I heard.
a
The
setup
tarp,
to happen. You take the roof off of something
Yeah.
and bad weather comes.
the tarp blew off overnight.
That's how water works.
Yeah, yeah.
We were here that afternoon, right before the rain started.
When everybody was coming back from the mission trip, y'all didn't go on
No,
the mission
we
trip?
were here, Clarence was here cleaning.
Uh-huh,
And we were here doing something, maybe with Clarence, I don't remember. But anyway, we left and we'd gotten just down the road. It started raining and Clarence called. He said, "Oh my gosh, you've got to come here." And it's coming in everywhere. It was coming, just pouring in through the roof. And we were going, oh, well, we don't, and there were no tarps up there.
Yeah.
And so
Tarp
we
blew
were just
off.
like, what are we gonna do? And Gary had been gone and he pulled up in the driveway right as all this was happening too.
yeah, that's why I heard they were coming back from a mission trip in Michigan, and come back to that, and the, you know, whole western half of the church is underwater. And so out of the building, or out of the sanctuary, I should say, for how long? How long did y'all meet in the Doxa?
Over a year.
And again, the story I heard was that in combination with a lot of the debt issues, financial, and there was just a lot of, you know, even leadership decisions being made out of a place of kind of fear, and that the church felt it and shrunk, and that, I mean, by the time I came in 2015, I think it was just a little over 100 people on a Sunday on average. So, I mean, the version of the story I heard was, yeah, the church in that year that you're out of the sanctuary, cut in half, something like that. I mean, does that sound accurate?
I don't know, but I think the record should show that we had a music director who came and really gave us a shot in the arm.
Is that Lance? No.
Miller.
Tim Vanderbilt.
Tim
Tim.
Vanderbilt.
back.
Oh, yes, that's good.
And he really, I know there was our group, at least, maybe the older people, man, he really, like I said, just really helped us with the worship.
This is in the 90s,
Yeah,
probably.
and
Oh,
he
okay.
was more than just, he was the associate pastor.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
he was more than, I mean, music was a big part of it, but he did a lot of other things.
And the Lord had a lot for him to do, because look how he was found by a couple of missionaries on a pile of junk in, where was it, Korea?
Korea.
That's his birth story she's telling you.
Yeah.
Well,
He was abandoned as a
He had been
baby.
thrown away, and I understand that the trash was burning, and, someone heard him crying and got the little baby out, and then he was later adopted by, I think Swedish Baptist pastor, is that correct?
I don't recall that part of the story.
I thought they were
It's his-
missionaries.
Missionary.
wow.
Yeah.
Nice.
So,
Left on the
it's
doorstep.
an amazing story that he had. We lost him way too early in life. He was only 50
Mm.
when he
And I
passed
think he
away, but
appeared on the doorstep of the pastor who was having a deacon's meeting at his house
Mm.
in a basket.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that. So he was here through the 90s as associate pastor under Gary.
And
But
he
then
got-
God used him when he left, because
Oh,
he
yeah.
became a prison minister as he was dying. He had
Wow.
cancer. And he said, you know, they gave him like 6 months and he lived a few years. And that whole time he was going around preaching about how great God was.
Wow.
And a lot of it was at the prison ministry.
Mm.
He was
Just-
fabulous.
Yeah.
He was,
yeah.
And we could tell the story of Bethany with just the people that worked on staff that we had, and we're leaving out a lot of people.
Yeah.
Like Dave Cross was here years ago as a Covenant Seminary intern, and he was here when Elmer Fisher was here.
Yeah.
Then he went on he met his wife and he went on and worked with New Tribes Mission,
Hmm.
and now with another group, but we have so many names of people, youth pastors,
Mm.
Yeah.
wonderful people.
I could tell lots of stories about Dave Cross. He lived with us. while he was here.
Mm. Mm.
so did Tim Vanderbilt for a while, right?
Tim lived with us, right?
Everybody lived at Barbara's house.
At some point.
And we do have some records of fun things, like we used to have dinner theaters with the dinner, I mean, you can only accommodate 100 or so, but my friend Joyce and I used to cater those. And then we didn't want to do it anymore, then my daughter started taking it over. But anyhow, I was going to tell you about that Miller family. He was in music, and we hired him from Central Press, I think. And anyhow, his son was converted at 5 in this church. So when I see his mother, she'll mention that. And he has a ministry in Guatemala, and it's huge.
Mm.
He had schools for, teach kids cooking, hairdressing, oh, it's fabulous.
Mm.
So we don't know all the good that came out
Right.
of things, you know?
You'll never know, right? You'll never know.
Right.
One thing you should know about June is she's a dietitian, and her specialty is cooking for large groups. And she has cooked for so many large groups in the kitchen that you have, and she's done weddings and banquets,
Right.
all kinds of things throughout all of her life. Years ago, she worked at one of the Delmar Gardens nursing home, and
Next door.
Jewish Center for the
Jewish.
Aged, and Doug worked in pots and pans and washed
Yes, and he
dishes with
taught me
her.
foot
Oh.
mopping. He and his brother used to do foot mopping.
What other big, milestone moments am I missing in the history? I know there's the planting of Christ Church. That would have been sometime. Were you guys still here at that point? Fisher?
We had just left.
You had just left. So
I would put planting in quotes.
okay, yeah. Well, and I've heard different versions of that story
Well,
too.
we had planted several churches. Emmanuel in St. Charles.
What was Emmanuel? I've never.
Was our plan?
These were all BGC churches that we worked to plant. I mean, you
Are
know,
any of them still
all of
around
the
today?
history of a church is, as you know, there are times where the Lord is really blessing. There are times where maybe in part because of our shortcomings, difficulties are encountered, or maybe it's just external circumstances. But we worked to plant a church out in St. Charles County. We planted one in South County. Neither of those made it. The South County one actually merged into, I think, an evangelical free church down there when they really saw they weren't gonna make it as an independent church, but there were a lot of people there. And they joined an existing church, and we worked with a couple, there were several others, and, you know, for whatever reason, none of them really endured as a BGC church.
That's what I was gonna ask, if there are any of those churches that have been planted out of this one that are still around. I mean, I've heard of, again, the kind of accidental plant of the Crossing, and I've heard the new community
But
church.
yeah, the more
story.
formal ones were,
Christ Church.
you know, Emmanuel in St. Charles, the one in South County, which I don't recall the name of. There was one a little bit further out in sort of the Baldwin area where Dan Paterka, our associate pastor, went there. And I believe there was one other, so, yeah, I mean,
Lance Swearingen.
Lance was out in St. Charles later, so there were two efforts in St. Charles. That
Wow.
one merged into another church essentially, I think.
And were most of those just growing so big here, and we need to,
I think from the beginning, we had an emphasis on church planning. The denomination had an emphasis on church planning.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there's some statistical work, I don't know if it still holds, that a high percentage of new believers, you reach more
More
people
likely.
become believers
Yeah.
through church plants than from existing churches where we can get caught up in just sort of, you know, continuing the existing organization.
Right. Yeah.
Well, we bought land, out on 109
And
and
Paterka's church.
Manchester. Was that Paterka's
Yeah,
church?
yeah.
Wow. So many interesting. So yeah, we could probably back up and do a lot of different milestone. Other ones that occur to y'all as
Yeah.
being really big and
Well,
formative in the history of
one
the church.
thing was, at one point, we were considered the sister church of the African American church that Harry Walls was in charge of.
Oh, Christ Fellowship.
And we would go, Brian and I were kind of involved with them a good bit, but at one point they invited our congregation to come there and have church with them, and then they fed us a picnic, or it was not it was good. So then we had them back here, and I will never forget this. We were cooking, I think it was June, me, Jan Deerberg, and Gary Brooks kept saying, there's not enough food, there's not gonna be enough food, and like, 2 loaves, you know, whatever, and there was enough food. But that was really a big thing. And when I think about, you know, our church emphasizing growing culturally, I think it would be a great idea for some of the people who've never even been to an African American church to go to Harry's church.
Mm-hmm. Oh, they came here. Was it last year? 2 years ago?
I don't-
Remember?
Yep.
They had a son. Brian remembers because it dramatically impacted the culture of our worship that morning.
Well, that's,
Yeah.
I don't remember.
I asked him how much I would have to pay him to just close up there and just come join our church. And can we merge? And I'll even let you preach some, but you just got to bring your people here every Sunday.
We were
They
there one
wouldn't bite.
time.
They wouldn't do it. So.
And Harry was preaching, and there was this lady going up and down the aisle. Okay. We were at Harry's church, and he was preaching, and he preaches in this sing-song kind of thing he gets into. But there was a lady the entire time who was going up and down the aisles. This is rude, the preacher. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus. And it went on the entire time.
Yeah.
And nobody noticed it.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure they did. Nobody said anything. But yeah.
We noticed it.
Oh yeah, you know it. Yeah, yeah. That's great. Other like just on the historical, like, oh, how can we not mention this? Other big moments, ministries, people that need to be mentioned here. I know, again, we've already gone way over an hour, and I want to respect everyone's time. We're already going to have to split this into at least 2 or 3 different, parts of podcast episodes for people to listen to. But other things you'd want to throw out, I want to end by asking y'all a more subjective question of just how has God used this church in your own life over the years. But anything else on the historical side of things?
One of my favorite memories here is on Sunday nights we had testimony services. And I came after some of the issues happened with Leanne Leggett, who's now Leanne Freeman. But the whole story of how Leanne's parents, Kathleen and Joe, found the Lord. Leanne was in a terrible car accident. And this was such a small community back then. Everybody knew about it. She was a Parkway West student. People just said, Elmer, you've got to go to the hospital and meet the parents. Long story short, he led him to the Lord, and that family had a lot of things happen to them that were so difficult, including Leanne's health over the years. But God used, especially Kathleen, as a person to draw people to Christ, and she had her neighbors come, because you could not watch Kathleen's hard life. She had breast cancer a number of times, her daughter had spinal meningitis, almost died. Leanne's whole life changed. Later, Joe took his life because she had been living with him, and he had pretty severe bipolar illness. You could not watch Kathleen's life and not see the Lord Jesus Christ in it. And then she was found dead one day when she didn't answer the phone, and she had fallen asleep in her chair with her Bible in front of her. I think she was just turned 80. I don't know. She left us way too soon, but there are stories like that that pulled the people together, and we got to watch God work that way. Yeah, I can think of several of those.
Leanne and Larry called me last night, but Joe Leggett brought John to this church, and that's where we met.
Your husband, John Smith, and you guys met here. Wow, I don't think I realized that either.
And you were a good cat too.
Well, God, I mean,
Yes, she was.
that's a pretty easy answer to the question of how has God used and blessed your life through the ministry of this church with how many 60 years of marriage?
No, we were married
50?
for 46 years.
46, okay.
Before he
Yeah.
passed.
Yeah, so marriage, you guys met, you said, through the ministry of the church. Other ways that, just in closing here, I don't know, 2 minutes or less, that you have been blessed personally through the ministry of the church, and or seen God use this church to bless the lives of others, if there's any last little stories you want to tell.
Well, I would say, I was Southern Baptist, graduate of a Baptist college, but I grew when Pastor Fisher became my pastor. I grew spiritually. I give this church all the credit.
Well, yeah, we want to give the Lord
Give
the credit.
God- give
If
God all
my dad
the
was
glory.
around, he'd want
Yeah.
to say that.
Yeah. give
It was
God the
getting
glory.
about time for Mike to go to college, and so I was talking to Pastor Fisher about it and trying to decide, where we were gonna go, and Pastor Fisher said he will go to Bethel. And he did, and that's where he met Diana.
Yeah.
Wow. Very neat. How about, I don't know, Brian, Sally, you guys have jumped in here. Do you want to share a quick, how has God used this church in your life?
So, this is Brian Arvison. I think I was saved before I came to West Hills, but I was baptized here by Gary Brooks, and that was a turning point in my life. I'm getting choked up just thinking about it, so. But I have grown so much because of the ministries of this church and the people that we know and love. I mean, I've shared with you that the reason that we did not move earlier this year is because our lives are just too intertwined with all of yours and with so many other people at this church, and we could not see ourselves leaving.
That's a good story.
That is a great story. That is a great story. Doug and Cindy, do y'all want to just last words on how God's used this church in your life, family's life?
Well, you know, when we, as a family, when I was in junior high school, when we moved down here, starting a church is a family effort. And moving down here was probably one of the best things, perhaps the best thing that ever happened to our family together, because we all worked together on a common goal, and we prayed and went through the ups and downs of church planting together, which is hard work. It's not for the timid. And there are great blessings, and there are setbacks that are challenging. And it really deepened my faith personally to go through and see how the Lord blessed us and sustained us, and even today sustains West Hills. So I think it was extremely formative for our family. And then, of course, that Cindy and I met here, and you know, the Lord's blessed us with, 41 and a half years of marriage. That's been a tremendous blessing.
We met at Bethany, but there was a small, we called it the youth group, even though we'd all graduated from college, or at least we're that age. And that group just kept growing and growing. We had Campus Crusade staff in it. We had a law student from WashU, a dental student from Washington University. People came from all over. And then we got married in 1983. Pretty much that year, the youth group collapsed because everybody got married.
To each other.
Yeah.
There's so many weddings, but it was a strong group, and we reached out with Covenant Presbyterian Church and did outreach and joined with them, and it was just a really good time.
Thank you. Sandy and June, last words.
Oh, last words, okay.
How has God used this church
Well,
to bless you and bless them?
Kind of nice for me to say that it started in my living room, and it's a testimony that we have this many people. And I think you're a good pastor.
Thank you.
You
And,
were smart to get to college, you were smart to stay in.
well, you were faithful to answer God's call to plant this church so many years ago. And like you said, think of how many lives have been touched and all the names that have been named on this podcast. And if we went another hour and a half, you'd name another 50, 100. So,
Well, I just want to say too, when we were at the VGC that year, that we decided a lot of things, we heard this guy from Lincoln, Nebraska, I can't think of his name, but anyhow, he said, there's somebody in this room that God wants to use to do something. And I said, hey, Lynn, it's us.
wow. Praise God. Thank you for obeying the call, and on behalf of, the hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of, probably thousands of lives that have been touched through the ministry of this church.
Yeah.
Just thank you for your faithfulness.
I like that, 1,000, wow, that's good.
It probably is in the thousands. I mean, think about it. Like I said,
Easily.
well, maybe you've been pushing 400 back 40, 50 years ago, pushing 400 again now. That's already being close to 1,000. So anyway, Barbara, you wanted to say one? No? Okay. Well, thank you. And I want to thank, on behalf of the church, thank all of you for taking this time to share your stories, help us fill in the gaps. Again, for me, the impetus for this really came out of just recently, preaching and sharing from Psalm 78, where Asaph says, I will open my mouth and utter things that we have heard and known. We will not hide them from our children, but tell the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders he has done. And I just thought, God has done glorious wonders here through the life of this church over the years. And, here's God's command to tell them to our children and our children's children and pass them on to the next generation. And especially, June, with, you in particular being the last founding member of the church and coming up on your 100th birthday. And God willing, you won't be here forever. I'm sure you're ready for heaven, maybe getting closer.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, my family.
I'm
wants-
ready,
My
but
family wants me to go to Bethesda, but those rooms are so small. And I
No.
have 8 rooms and stuff under the bed.
no. But you know, we will mourn and celebrate in equal parts whenever you do go home to be with the Lord. But I thought, hey, before you do, we want to capture all of your stories and have a chance to publicly thank you once again for your faithfulness, and same for Barbara, Sandy, so many of y'all. Thank you for taking the time, and you know, as we do pass the torch on to the next
You didn't
generation.
mention you used to pray after school and leave tracts in the mailboxes or something, or food. Yeah, you and Barbara. You had a ministry for a while.
So Len Nystrom's favorite hymn was "To God Be the Glory."
Mm.
Yeah.
And we would often sing that on anniversaries or special times
Mm.
of the church
Mm.
celebrating, and I think that's an apt
Mm-hmm.
reminder.
It is. To him be the glory. Great things he has
And my
done.
kids, they wanted to be here, and I'd say, "You got your homework done?" "Oh, yeah." Yeah, then we come home and they were doing homework.
You know, that's always good when kids are begging to stay at church longer.
I know.
You know, and that hadn't changed either. I mean, at least for my family, my kids are always begging. They love it here. So again, thank y'all. I mean, yes, to God be all the glory, and also we know He works through people, imperfect people, even like us. And I thank y'all for being a part of that, allowing Him to use you to help build the ministry of this church that is, continues to just minister to so many. And so thank you to our watchers, listeners, and excited to see what God. I mean, I can't end without, as the current pastor saying, and even with all of that, I have to believe that our best years are still to come. So let's not forget the great years, the glory years, but let's continue trusting God that He has even more in store for the life of this church. So we'll give Him all the praise. Yes. Thank y'all.
Amen.
God bless you.
Thank you.
Building, I was thinking of when we broke the tower.
Oh, yeah.
That was a little longer than I thought it would
You
be.
didn't ask about how the tower got to be.
Yeah.
Oh, the
that's
tower,
what-
yeah. We didn't even talk about
I was trying to think about it.
Good, good.
I mean, the